You are listening to part 3 of a 4-part class taught by Hunter, lead pastor at Fellowship Denver. This session is part of the larger Vision for Life ministry that has 2 expressions, classes that people participate in real time, as well as a weekly podcast. I'm Autumn, host of the podcast, and we'll be following up these live sessions with podcast episodes that develop and discuss your questions on navigating politics as a follower of Jesus. Thank you for joining us and engaging this important topic.
All right. Well, tonight we are going to talk about debating, discussing, and voting. Debating politics, discussing politics. I know that debating and discussing, there's a fine line between those. We're going to talk about what it means to debate and discuss in a healthy way, what it means to debate and discuss in an unhealthy way. And then we're going to talk about a Christian mindset toward voting. Now, all these topics actually kind of work together. So what I want to do tonight is I want to actually frame up for you some of the cultural trends inside the Christian church that are affecting how we process political questions. They are affecting our conversations, our debating, our discussing, and they are affecting the conversation about how should you vote. So rather than just kind of going, here's some principles for having good conversations, here's some principles for deciding how to vote, I actually want to zoom out and I want to talk about some trends within the American Christian church, some cultural trends within the American Christian church. Now, next week, we're going to talk about some cultural trends in America, and we're going to talk about some history of America. Tonight, we're going to focus that lens on the church in particular, the capital C church in particular. So I'm going to call this first section tonight, Political Cultures in American Christianity. Now, that's a mouthful, and I couldn't think of a more simple way to say it. So let me explain what I mean by political cultures. I mean that there are actually several cultures of people and several subcultures of Christianity that comprise what we might call the totality of the American church. And all of these cultures have their own inclinations politically. They are inclined to prioritize certain political issues. They see political issues through the lens of their culture, which a culture is just a way you make sense out of reality. So in their culture, they've been perhaps raised, they've been taught, they've just been conditioned by the church stream that they're swimming in to see political matters in a particular way. And tonight, I'm going to talk about 3 cultures that are really affecting how the American church as a whole debates and discusses politics. Now, before I introduce these 3 cultures, these are not the totality. These are not the only 3 American Christian cultures that have political opinions, but these 3, I think, are informing and shaping the debate and the discussion about politics that's happening inside the American church. So really, these 3 cultures seem to be the ones that are really setting the terms of the debate and are also pretty vociferous in the debate. So we're going to talk about these 3 cultures. Now, second thing, I'm going to try to describe them as factually as possible. Now, I recognize when I say factually, I recognize that there's some judgment that goes into what facts you choose to emphasize and not emphasize. So this is not maybe a completely neutral presentation of facts, and that might be impossible. But when I say factually, I'm just going to try to describe at a factual level what these cultures are saying about politics, what they're saying to each other, some of the debates they are having with each other. And I'm going to try to describe it without refereeing the debate or without making commentary on who's got the better points. I'm just going to try to describe it factually. So if you hear something tonight, and you probably will, that makes you uncomfortable, just know that I'm presenting it as a fact. And it may be an uncomfortable fact. Some of these facts are uncomfortable. They make me uncomfortable. But this is what's happening in American Christianity. The first culture I want to talk about, we're going to call white evangelicals. Now, this term evangelical, some of you don't know where this term comes from. So let me give you a little history of the term. It's actually really helpful to know the history of the term. In the early life of America, before it was even founded as a nation, there was a revival called the First Great Awakening, and the children of the First Great Awakening came to be known as evangelicals. The term evangel means gospel, so these became known as gospel people, evangelicals. There was a Second Great Awakening. The children of the Second Great Awakening became known as evangelicals. And evangelicals, this tended to emphasize the importance of personal conversion. So they looked at Jesus' teaching on new birth in particular, and they said that is necessary. It's not enough just to be born and raised in a Christian church, but you need to be born again by the Spirit, which is theologically correct. So they tended to emphasize the importance of new birth, the importance of conversion, and then as a result of that, you had a living relationship with God. This was often set over against what they would call dead orthodoxy, meaning we believe Christianity, in an intellectual sense, we go to church perhaps, but it's not really making a vital difference in our lives. These were called the evangelicals. This was the most powerful religious movement in America up until about 1900. And at the beginning of the 20th century, American Christianity goes through a number of cultural shifts, a lot of it around urbanization, more and more people moving to cities, and around scientific revolution in particular. And as a result of this cultural shift, Christians began to ask, how do we react to this cultural shift? And there was really two big streams. One was the majority stream, and one was the reaction to that majority. The majority stream said we must modernize, this was their term, we must modernize Christianity in order to still maintain our appeal to the American public. And what they meant by modernize is we've got to shave off the things that people have a difficulty believing. And in this time, it was mostly scientific things. So they had trouble with like the resurrection of Jesus from the dead, the virgin birth. They said, you don't have to believe in that stuff. They called themselves modernist, or they called themselves liberals. They really gained control of most of the institutions within the different denominations, the seminaries, the big churches, the media platforms, that kind of thing. The reaction to that was called the fundamentalists. They said we must emphasize and believe the fundamentals of the faith. And the fundamentalists over time separated from the liberals or the modernists. And the fundamentalists were not terribly politically engaged. The liberals were, but the fundamentalists weren't. Then in the 1940s, a movement of folks, primarily from within the fundamentalist stream, said we need to be just as orthodox in believing the gospel as the fundamentalists, but we need to be engaged in the culture. And we need to do it with evangelistic zeal. We need to be engaged in the social problems. The book that I recommended to you last week, the little book, The Uneasy Conscience of Modern Fundamentalism, was one of the books published in that time, and it said fundamentalists aren't engaged with solving the social problems of the world. So they called this new movement the neo or the new evangelicals, and over time, that term got shortened to evangelical. There were three leaders who were kind of the figureheads of this movement. It wasn't like an organized thing. They started organizations, but it was more like a movement, and they were kind of the three figureheads. Billy Graham is the one you probably know and have heard of. There was also a pastor theologian named Harold Ockenga, who was a pastor of a very prominent church in Boston. And then there was an academic theologian, Harvard trained and also theologically trained, Carl F.H. Henry, who wrote that book, The Uneasy Conscience of Modern Fundamentalism. They said we need to be engaged in the world. Now, they started in the 1940s. This movement started in the 1940s. It grew in the 1950s and 60s. Strangely, modernism, it's actually not strange, modernism or liberalism began to die and wane. It was the majority for a while. Then it begins to die and wane because it didn't have the gospel. And when you don't have the gospel, you really don't have power, the power source of, God. So it grows, it becomes a movement, but it's not very politically engaged. This was the buildup. It's not very politically engaged until 1970, in pre-1970. after 1970, it begins to become more politically engaged. And this was primarily led by what we would call the baby boomer generation. It began to be more politically engaged. Jimmy Carter was elected president in 1976. He was a self-professed evangelical. Some of them got dissatisfied with him, and by 1980, in these next 4 years, evangelicals become really politically engaged. There was a movement called the Moral Majority that started in 1979. It basically said we need to be politically engaged to reclaim America from moral decline. And so they were primarily engaged around moral issues or issues of values, or you might say. They became, really starting in 1980, a Republican constituency. They were a part of Reagan's coalition, and they have stayed a Republican constituency ever since Reagan in 1980. They were largely suburban and middle and upper middle class. White, suburban, middle, and upper middle class tended to be where evangelicalism was the strongest. So this movement was strongest in the suburbs of major American cities. In fact, it started large churches and then had numerous smaller churches throughout the suburbs of major American cities. So it tended to be middle, upper middle class. They were historically not engaged on matters of race. So this movement was not very politically active during the Civil Rights Movement. It existed during the Civil Rights Movement, but it wasn't very active in the Civil Rights Movement. And some of them even actively said we need to sit this out. So they weren't terribly engaged on matters of race. They were more engaged on other matters of morality. That'll become important in just a minute. The keystone issue for them became abortion. When Roe v. Wade was passed in 1973, anti-abortion or pro-life was largely considered a Roman Catholic issue. Now, I'm not talking about Roman Catholics as one of these cultures, but we could add them in. But Roman Catholics have a deep history of political thought and political engagement, and they were very active. Active after Roe v. Wade in seeking to reduce or eliminate abortion. So right after Roe v. Wade, evangelicals weren't very active, but they get rallied around that in the late 70s and 80s. So we're talking 5, 6, 7 years after Roe v. Wade, and it becomes a keystone issue that rallies them politically. Okay, now let's talk about a second stream. A second stream that's really shaping the discourse today is what we're just going to call the Black church. And the Black church became a traditionally Democratic constituency, especially after the Civil Rights Movement. Now, it has a deep history of political engagement, and it really predates the Civil Rights Movement. But you probably think of the Civil Rights Movement as the African American church's kind of main political moment. But the Civil Rights Movement really divided the Democratic Party. The Democratic coalition during the Civil Rights Movement had what we might call conservative Democrats, what we might call progressive or liberal Democrats. It had Southern Democrats who were segregationists. But the Civil Rights Movement, after the Civil Rights Act was passed in 1964, the Civil Rights Movement really aggravated the Southern segregationist Democrats, and they over the next really 10 years, they pretty much leave the Democratic Party. Most of them become Republicans. And so the Black church becomes a more powerful constituency, a more influential constituency within the Democratic Party. And you probably have watched politics. You've watched, like, for example, when the Democrats go and have their primary in South Carolina, the issue is always the vote of African Americans, and the Black church has a lot of influence and power in shaping how African Americans vote. It's a traditional Democratic constituency for the last 50, 60 years. The Black church is very socioeconomically diverse. It represents inner city and poor African Americans. In inner city and poor don't always go together, but they have. They did and have for the last 30, 40, 50 years. But there's also a vast African-American middle class and upwardly mobile African-Americans. And really they're all all of those different socioeconomic strata, many of them have ties to the African American church. Um, their keystone issue has always been racial justice. It's always been matters of, and that's not just seeing unjust laws outlawed. It's also been related to issues of poverty, of education, anything that would help African American people advance. So this has always been their kind of keystone, their keystone issue. Now I'm going to describe a third stream, which is newer. And this third stream I'm going to call new urbanized Christianity. And I'll explain in a minute why I'm using that term urbanized, but it is a newer stream of Christianity that has primarily uh, uh, come of age in the last 20 years. It starts in the 1990s. It really starts growing in the early 2000s. Fellowship Denver, by the way, planted in 2006. So we were a church that was planted as this new urbanized Christianity is becoming more powerful in American culture and especially within the church. So it's a newer stream than white evangelicals or the black church, but it emerged from both of them, and by that I simply mean it's probably more represented by white evangelicals, but there's a number of young African American leaders, and when I say young, I mean primarily Gen X and younger, who have been very, very prominent in seeing this new urbanized Christianity. It coincided with, it really rode what I'm calling the return to the cities, which was the return of young people, especially desiring to live in urban centers as opposed to out in the suburbs. And you can look around and you can observe that many major American cities have seen an influx of residents since 1990. Here in Denver, Coors Field was built, I believe it was 1995. Someone can give me the right date on that. But that started a process of gentrification in downtown Denver that has really continued unto this day. I remember first coming to Denver to work in the summer of 2000, and downtown was really bustling at the time. And you could see from Union Station to I-25. Now you can't see to I-25 from Union Station because there's all buildings built up between there. What happened here has happened in a lot of major cities. It also brought issues of gentrification. So wealthier, largely white populations displacing people who had lived in those city centers for longer periods of time. So it brought some discomfort and some questions around gentrification. It's largely Gen X and millennials. It's this new urbanized Christianity is theologically kin to evangelicalism. And by that, I just mean that it has very similar theology, if not the same theology as evangelicals have always had. It believes in the gospel. It believes in historic Christianity, but this is where the tension starts to come in. It's more culturally diverse than white evangelicalism, and it's more politically diverse as well. So these are all characteristics of this kind of new urbanized Christianity. Now, I wanted us to think of these as three streams flowing together inside what we're calling the American church. And the reason I'm talking about these three streams, white evangelicalism, the historic black church, and this new urbanized Christianity, these three streams all have particular political dispositions. One of them is particularly disposed toward conservative politics and is animated by the issue, especially of abortion. But there's other issues as well, but that's kind of a keystone issue for them. The other is a traditional constituency of the Democratic Party and is particularly animated around issues of racial justice. And then this newer stream has elements of both in them and has some of the political influences of both in them as well. And so it can't be pegged with one political ideology. Now, I'm I'm going to make the case that whether you live in a city or not, if you are a Christian in America, you actually can't escape the influence that this new urbanized Christianity is having. And to make that point, I'm going to um, borrow from a great sociologist named Peter Berger. Peter Berger is a sociologist who actually became a Christian late in his life, I believe. And Peter Berger is probably the preeminent sociologist of uh, of 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 the modern mind, like what happens as the world becomes more modern and especially as it becomes more urban. And he developed a concept that he called the urbanization of consciousness, meaning even if you don't live in a city, our consciousness, the way we think, the way we experience the world, and in our case, the way we experience life inside the church is very much like living in a city. So here's what Peter Berger says. He says, since its inception in ancient times, the city has been a meeting place of widely different peoples and groups, and thus a meeting place of discrepant worlds. By its very structure, the city pushes its inhabitants to be urbane with regard to strangers and sophisticated about different approaches to reality. Someone is urbane if they've read widely, they've learned widely, they've had many different experiences. So Peter Berger is saying, when you put people in a city and they live close to people who are from other worlds, they have to develop an understanding of different points of view. And so they tend to develop a consciousness that has more layers to it. One of the ways I like to describe it is before I moved to Denver, I didn't know anything about the Midwest. I've never been to Ohio. I've never been to Michigan. I wouldn't know anything about them if I didn't live in Denver, because I used to live in Arkansas, and then after that I lived in Texas. And we ignore the Midwest there. But here you can't ignore the Midwest because so many people move here from the Midwest. So I had to become more sophisticated in my understanding of American culture. And I've learned a lot about the Midwest from people who have moved here. And so I feel like I understand America a little better. I actually didn't know much about the West Coast either. And now I probably have as many friends on the West Coast as I have in the South. So this is what cities do to you. It brings these people together from discrepant worlds. Modernity in any society has meant the gigantic growth of cities. This urbanization has not only been a matter of physical growth of certain communities and the development of specifically urban institutions, urbanization is also a process on the level of consciousness. And as such, it has not been limited to those communities that can properly be designated as cities. Now, here's what he's saying. Even if you don't live in a city, you as America becomes a more modern nation and a more urban nation, you are thinking like people who live in cities. Okay? Now, here's what it means for us. Even if you aren't involved in one of these new urban Christian churches that brings together kind of different streams of Christianity, you're still dealing with and wrestling with the problems that presents. Now, why is that? Here's Peter Berger's answer to why. The urbanization of consciousness has been brought about especially through the modern media of mass communication. Now, he wrote this in 1970s when mass communication meant the TV, where they had like 4 channels on it, and the radio. So you can imagine how much our consciousness has become more urbanized as we become connected through the internet. So he says to be linked to these media is to be involved in the continuing urbanization of consciousness. Plurality is intrinsic to the process, meaning multiple different perspectives and viewpoints. The individual, wherever he may be, is bombarded with a multiplicity of information and communication. In terms of information, this process proverbially broadens the mind. And by the same token, however, it weakens the integrity and plausibility of his home world. Meaning, if you were raised inside one of those streams of Christianity, and then as your consciousness becomes more urbane, or as you get involved in a city, as you get involved in an urban church, you get exposed to perspectives from outside your home world. So if you were raised in white evangelicalism, you get exposed to to perspectives that are outside your home world. And so you start wrestling with questions that you didn't have to wrestle with when you were just living in that world. That is informing a lot of the political tension that's inside the church. So here's our three cultures that are flowing together. I want you to think of them as three rivers that are flowing together: white evangelicalism, black church, new urban Christianity. And the confluence of these three rivers is creating turbulence inside the church for how we talk about politics and what political issues we emphasize, because these things bring different political emphases and perspectives with them. Now, I'm going to call the last 6 years the Great Disruption. And I'm going back to 2014. You might think of these three rivers flowing together, and anytime rivers flow together, there's a little bit of turbulence. But I would say until 2014, these three streams existed together in what we might call, there was some unease. There was some, especially around politics. There were questions about now you guys vote Republican, right? And you guys vote Democrat, and are we free to vote either way? There were questions about that, and there were maybe some discomfort that for some that those were questions. But these three streams still work together pretty cohesively until, I'm going to say, 2014. Now, the reason I've chosen 2014 is because at the end of that year, Michael Brown was killed in Ferguson, Missouri, by a white police officer named Darren Wilson. And that event set off a lot of unrest around issues of race. And that happened both in the culture and in the church. The church starts having a pretty significant conversation about race. Now, that conversation is going, and we can begin to see these different political perspectives happening. Barack Obama is president then. I can remember I lived here in Denver when Obama was nominated for president in 2008, and I remember watching how many folks in this new urban Christianity were really supportive of Obama. Of course, people from the black church tradition were supportive of Obama. White evangelicals were still supportive of John McCain and the Republican Party then. But I could see these tensions happening, but it wasn't really, it didn't feel terribly tense. And fun story, by the way, there was a protest where they burned Dick Cheney in effigy, a giant paper mache head of Dick Cheney. They burned him in effigy right outside the Fellowship Denver as we were gathering on Sunday. Dick Cheney got burned in effigy. That was around the political convention, the Democratic convention. That was like the most tense it ever got, and then the protest disappeared the next day. So, but in 2014, we start having this pretty painful reckoning around issues of race, and then in 2016, that happened. Now, I'm just speaking factually here, but there were lots of different reactions, especially to the candidacy of Donald Trump and to what Christians should do with the candidacy of Donald Trump. Even within these three streams, they start fracturing about Trump. So the white evangelicals, who had traditionally been a conservative Republican constituency, there's actually three reactions within white evangelicalism about Trump. There's three major reactions. Some said we can't ever vote for Trump, and so that was one reaction. A second reaction was a reluctant acceptance of Trump. It was if this is going to be the Republican candidate, this is better than the alternative. So we've got to vote for him. And it's the lesser of two evils kind of approach. And so there was a reluctance, but ultimately an acceptance of Trump. And then there were actually some white evangelicals who were very pro-Trump. There were some very prominent pastors who became even more politically active than they had ever been in their life as a result of Trump courting them and them becoming part of his coalition. So these reactions, now a majority of white evangelicals probably voted for Trump. That's what it looks like. But there were three pretty different reactions to his candidacy. So even the white evangelicals kind of start now fragmenting a little bit as a result of Trump. The black church was pretty aligned in being against Trump, primarily because of issues of white supremacy. They felt like Trump would instigate and stir up racial feelings through what's commonly called dog whistling. Dog whistling is where you don't say explicitly racist things, but you say it in a way that those who are can hear it. It's like it sits at a frequency they can hear. So there was a lot of concern coming from the black church about that. In particular, there was also concern coming from people of color over his more hardline stances on immigration. So then they start saying, especially to white evangelicals, I thought you're our brothers and sisters in Christ. How can you support this guy who we think is so damaging to us? So it becomes a very tense issue between white evangelicals and the black church. Within the new urbanized Christianity, there's not a lot of support for Trump. There's some, but there's probably not a lot. But you can see this division starting to break down within kind of this new urbanized Christianity as well. The result has been since 2016. There's been a lot of political and cultural tension inside the church, and I should probably insert the word escalating. There's been escalating political and cultural tension inside the church since 2016, and a lot of it has broken down along these different cultural lines and along those keystone issues. So many white evangelicals have said, we're going to continue to vote Republican because we prioritize the issue of abortion, which is what they always have. And then that has, things underneath it. We don't want to see money given to Planned Parenthood. We want to see conservative Supreme Court justices nominated. Many black Christians have said, well, we absolutely can, not only can we not support Trump, but we now have to work to actively defeat him. And then they're very upset at white evangelicals, and many urbanized Christians are trying to figure out how to kind of restore some kind of political stability or normalcy. So I'm framing all that up to say that's the context in which we today, whenever we have a conversation about politics, these are the streams that are flowing together and are influencing the conversation we're having. So I want to talk about this question. How do you debate and discuss politics in an era of political and cultural tension inside the church? Now, I want to refer back to something I said at the beginning, which was debating and discussing politics is one of our main political activities, one of the main ways we engage in politics as people. The debating and discussing politics is not inconsequential. It's not like, just quit doing that, quit discussing politics. It's not that simple. It's actually having conversations about important issues where there is disagreement and where we can edify possibly one another. That's actually a really good thing. Like, we call this vision for life. And part of my vision for your life is that you would be good about having constructive conversations about things that matter to you and things that matter to our life together. So this is really good, but it's also hard to do. And I would say, from where I sit as a pastor, it's exposing a lot of immaturity inside the church. Now, it's not a coincidence that I chose to preach a sermon series from 1 Corinthians 13 in a political season, because, just to be frank, my observation of most Christians, and I'm saying this of all three of those streams that we've talked about, my observation is that most Christians are more developed in their ability to think and in their ability to argue than they are in their ability to love others and to have mature conversations. So this is the area to grow. Now this may annoy you, but as your pastor, I care less about figuring out for you the right answer to every political issue, because I think there's a lot of work being done there to figure out to think through issues. And there's a lot of bad stuff out there, but there's a lot of good stuff out there too, a lot of good thought. And then when I sit down and talk with many of you about politics, we actually have really good conversations. I really enjoy talking with you. I enjoy talking with you when we disagree on matters of politics. I actually really enjoy talking with you, but my observation is we don't talk to each other very well at all. So I want us to talk about how we as God's people can create a better container for meaningful political conversations. And I'm acknowledging with this that many of our disagreements are cultural. And by that I mean the things that we see as really important and that we tend to emphasize comes not just from being really logical people who have weighed everything out perfectly, kind of like we talked about wisdom last week. We talked about how you prioritize things as a matter of wisdom. A lot of how we end up weighting things is also influenced by what we've been kind of conditioned by the culture we've been in to weight, and the experiences we've had and the people we know and what we see. In the last 15 years, I've become friends with quite a few African American pastors. These are friendships I did not have 15 years ago. That is a change of culture for me, and that's affected issues that I see. So we all see things through a cultural lens. And so what do we do when we bring different cultural perspectives to play, especially as it pertains to politics? And how do we have a good conversation? For that question, I want to introduce you to Romans chapter 14. Now, I think it's worth us taking some time and just reading this out loud together, and I'm going to pull out a few principles for us. But the context of Romans 14, there's a very similar dialogue or a very similar teaching in 1 Corinthians chapter 8. The context of Romans 13 is that the church in Rome is made up of two different cultures. It's made up of Jewish Christians and Greco-Roman Christians. And there was a lot of tension in the early Christian churches around the Jewish dietary laws. This was a cultural tension point. Do we have to keep them? Can we eat? Do we need to eat according to those laws or not? Many Jewish people were disposed to keep those laws, and Gentile people were disposed not to keep those laws. And they were also disposed to correcting their Jewish friends and saying, guys, you could eat anything you want to if you just relax a little bit, right? So this was a cultural issue. Now, there were some who made it they tried to make it an issue of salvation, but that's not the case in the church in Rome. That's not the case in the church in Corinth. And so Paul is writing, how do you guys live together despite the fact that you weight this issue differently? And here's what he says. As for the one who is weak in faith, welcome him, but not to quarrel over opinions. Now, you're going to see the one who is weak is one whose conscience is more constrained. So they say, I can't do this. The one who Paul's going to call strong is the one whose conscience feels like it has more options open to it. Now, to put that onto our debates, if you say, my conscience is constrained, I could never vote for a Democrat because they are pro-choice. Or if you say my conscience is constrained, I could never vote for a Republican. Or my conscience is constrained, I can never vote for Trump. Okay, you're kind of beginning to sense this. If you would say I could actually vote for any, my conscience is open, then you would be what Paul calls the strong. We might inhabit both of those in our position. We might say I could never vote for this, but I could do this, and other Christians would go, how could you do that? You can't do that. You got to do this. But this is the debate we're having. So here's what Paul says. As for those who are weak in faith, welcome him, but not to quarrel over opinions. One person believes he may eat anything while the weak person eats only vegetables. Let not the one who eats despise the one who abstains, and let not the one who abstains pass judgment on the one who eats, for God has welcomed him. Who are you to pass judgment on the servant of another? It is before his own master that he stands or falls, and he will be upheld, for the Lord is able to make him stand. One person esteems one day as better than another, while another esteems all days alike. This was a debate about the Jewish feasts and festivals. Each one should be fully convinced in his own mind. The one who observes the day observes it in honor of the Lord. The one who eats, eats in honor of the Lord, since he gives thanks to God, while the one who abstains, abstains in honor of the Lord and gives thanks to God. For none of us lives to himself, and none of us dies to himself. For if we live to the Lord. If we die to the Lord. So then, whether we live or whether we die, we are the Lord's. For this end Christ died and lived again, that he might be Lord of both the dead and the living. Why do you pass judgment on your brother, or why do you despise your brother? For we will all stand before the judgment seat of God. For it is written, as I live, says the Lord, every knee shall bow to me, and every tongue shall confess to God. So each of us will give an account of himself to God. Therefore, let us not pass judgment on one another any longer, but rather decide never to put a stumbling block or hindrance in the way of a brother. I know and am persuaded in the Lord Jesus that nothing is unclean in itself, but it's unclean for anyone who thinks that it is unclean. For if your brother is grieved by what you eat, you are no longer walking in love. By what you eat, do not destroy the one for whom Christ died. So do not let what you regard as good be spoken of as evil, for the kingdom of God is not a matter of eating and drinking, but of righteousness and peace and joy in the Holy Spirit. Whoever thus serves Christ is acceptable to God and approved by men. So then, let us pursue what makes for peace and for mutual upbuilding, which we've learned that's what love does. Do not, for the sake of food, destroy the work of God. Everything is indeed clean, but it's wrong for anyone who makes another stumble by what he eats. It is good not to eat meat or drink wine or do anything that causes your brother to stumble. The faith that you have, keep between yourself and God. Blessed is the one who has no reason to pass judgment on himself for what he approves. But whoever has doubts is condemned if he eats, because the eating is not from faith. For whatever does not proceed from faith is sin. Now, I want to try to draw some principles out of this. The first is this, that Paul is exhorting us to respect and welcome differences of conscience. He says each one should be fully convinced in his own mind, and then he says each will give an account of himself to God. Now, there's also an exhortation here. You need to work out where you stand on hot political issues, how you're going to vote. You need to work that out in your conscience. And as we're going to see, you need to not violate your conscience. So don't do anything that would be a violation of your conscience. And then, as you relate to your brothers and sisters who come from different cultural perspectives, we welcome each other and we respect differences on matters of conscience. Okay, here's a second principle. Recognize motive, not just logic or position. Now, there is a sense in which your vote does not recognize your motive, but inside the body of Christ, as we relate to each other, we take account not just of what position you take on that issue, we also take account of each other's motives. Paul says this, the one who observes the day, they had a debate about whether you should or should not observe a special day of fasting. Paul says the one who observes that, observes it in honor of the Lord, and the one who eats, eats in honor of the Lord. So he's saying you can fast and you can feast, and both of those can be done in honor of the Lord. Now, that's true, right? So he's saying then we should recognize each other's motives. If someone says, I am voting this way, and I'm voting this way because before God, I believe that is the best way to weigh all these issues out and vote. And I'm doing that out of worship to God, and I don't want to violate my conscience. We should respect that. We should respect that, even if we disagree. Now, discussion is allowed. There's a subtext here that discussion is allowed. Paul wants us to have good discussion about these matters in the body of Christ. But notice that he draws the line at quarreling, what he calls quarreling and despising your brother. He says, welcome him, but not to quarrel over opinions. So if a quarrel is an argument that leads to a rupture in the relationship, that's what a quarrel is. So Paul is urging us to maintain relationships. He says, let not the one who eats despise the one who abstains, and let not the one who abstains pass judgment on the one who eats, for God has welcomed him. We could make this say, let not the one who votes for Trump despise the one who votes for Biden. Let not the one who votes for Biden pass judgment on or despise the one who votes for Trump. To despise is to scorn someone based on a choice they've made that's different from yours. To basically go, they're just idiots. That's despising, and despising ruptures relationships. So it leads to quarreling. So the point here is that we need to have good conversations, but we need to not despise each other. Now, Paul also mentions this. The faith that you have, keep between yourself and God. He's talking here to people who think it's okay to eat anything. And he's like, look, if it causes your brother to stumble, or if it leads to quarreling, or if it leads to division, if you can't share your perspective on the matter without it opening up a debate, you do have this option. You can keep it between yourself and God. So you can be judicious. It's okay not to engage everyone. It's okay not to talk with everyone. It's okay to say, you know what, we just can't have this conversation. Sometimes I say to people, I would love to talk about that with you, but I just don't know if I'm able to do that. Or I don't know if I'm mature enough to have that conversation with you. So it's okay not to share your opinion with everyone. In fact, it's probably wise not to share your opinion with everyone. Let me go back to that. It's probably wise not to share your opinion with everyone. This is, I think, one of the downsides of social media. When you share your opinion on social media, you invite everyone to see it and to react to it. And some people that see it and react to it are probably capable of having great conversations with you, and some are not. And you have a hard time really knowing who you're sharing it with when you share it on social media. So that might be one, I'm not saying you have to do this, but that might be one argument for having more personal conversations and fewer online conversations about these issues. Now, here's the big thing, and this is my major pastoral burden. Paul says, recognize what's at stake here. And what's at stake is not unity in the body of Christ. That's at stake, but there's actually something bigger at stake than even like us getting along. What's at stake is actually people's faith. It's their spiritual health, and it's ultimately their faith itself that is at stake. Now, this is what he means when he says, by what you eat, do not destroy the one for whom Christ died. And what he means is this: if you, in exercising your Christian liberty, cause someone else to violate their conscience, or you cause a quarrel and dispute, you're actually harming their faith. So then, he says, let us pursue what makes for peace and mutual upbuilding. So you could actually tear people down with political debates. And just, I actually know, I talk to people, I hear their stories about why they have left the faith. And sometimes it is because I got tired of the politics within the church. So I, for example, think that the over-identification of any particular Christian stream with one political position is harmful to people's faith. And so I work hard not to over-identify us, not because I'm trying to be diplomatic or walk a tightrope, but because I care more about people's faith than I do about making a political point. So Paul says, do not, for the sake of food, destroy the work of God. Do not, for the sake of winning an argument about how a Christian should vote, destroy the work of God in someone. Now, let's say that you can engage. Let's talk about, though, how we can have healthy conversations, because it's weighted, it's heavy. Each other's faith is at stake if we don't do this well. On the other hand, I want us as a church and as a people to be the kind of community, when we actually recognize this weight, I think it actually sets us up to have good, constructive conversations, not to be scared to talk about politics within the church, but to have good, constructive conversations. And that's what I want. I want us to be that kind of community. I want us to love each other. I want us to respect each other's conscience. I want us to be able to welcome people of different cultural perspectives. I want us to grow in cultural diversity, which is going to mean political diversity. And I want us to be a container where people's faith can grow and not be derailed by division in the church over secondary things that aren't the gospel. But I also want us to be a church where we can have good, mature conversations. Like, let's be that people. People need that family. Many of our families aren't that. So people need that family. So here's some ways that we can engage conversations together. And I'm adapted this from a little article by Tim Keller called Gospel Polemics. You may be able to find it online, but it's in his book here, Center Church. And I've adapted it from that. I've reworded it a little bit to not be about theological debates, but also about political and cultural debates. Here are some rules of engagement. Never attribute to someone an opinion they themselves do not own. Here's how Tim Keller says it. Even if you believe that Mr. A's belief X could lead others to hold belief X, who hold belief X to hold belief Y, do not accuse Mr. A of holding belief Y if he disowns it. So if someone is explaining where they land politically or what they're going to do, you can't accuse them of then going, well, but you also believe all these other things. If they're going, you know what, I'm going to vote this way, even though I don't believe all those other things. That's what that would mean. Never attribute to someone an opinion they themselves do not own. Take someone's view in its entirety, not selectively. We should not isolate certain statements by Mr. A while overlooking or even concealing explanations, qualifications, or balancing statements he may have made elsewhere or right there at the same time. So listen to someone's view in its entirety. One of the things that I've enjoyed doing this year is sitting down with many of you and just listening to how you weigh out political matters. And I often find that when I can listen to the whole, not just, here's the decision I'm making about who I'm going to vote for. When I can listen to the whole, it's a very well thought out, articulate point of view. And so I think you actually would be surprised how many people are very thoughtful and articulate. So take someone's view in its entirety, not selectively. Represent their position. If you're going to argue it back, represent their position in its strongest form, not in a weak straw man form. Do the work necessary to articulate the views of your opponent with such strength and clarity that he or she could say, I couldn't have said it better myself. So represent their view in its best possible way, light, and in a way that strongest form that they themselves would agree with. You have properly represented my opinion. Seek to persuade, not antagonize. Persuade means to convince, but watch your motives. And Tim Keller says, it's possible to seek to be winsome and persuasive out of self-centeredness, a desire to be popular. It's also possible to be bold and strongly polemical out of self-centeredness rather than God-centeredness. Like I get something out of being right or winning the argument or getting the last word. And therefore, looking closely at our motives, we must take care that our polemics do not unnecessarily harden or antagonize. Now, this is where I found this really helpful because it helps recognize that our motives and why we want to debate this play into whether we're having a good, constructive conversation or we are quarreling and despising. This is my rule of engagement. I added this one, so not adapted, but added. Recognize legitimate critiques and weaknesses of your own position. And don't dismiss them with, what about blank? What about blank is when someone offers a critique of your position and you change the subject. So someone says, I'm really concerned that President Trump did not clearly denounce and distance himself from white supremacy in the debate on Tuesday night. And he, in fact, sounded like he gave a dog whistle shout out to a white supremacist group. That concerns me. He told them, stand back, stand by. And it's vague how to interpret that. They might interpret that as a sign of support. I'm concerned by that. What about abortion? Or I'm really concerned that the Democrats provide ongoing funding of tax dollars that supports abortion. And I'm concerned that they have a view of individual liberty that leads to an ever expanding opportunity for the strong, and in this case, mothers and fathers, to take advantage of the weak, the unborn. Oh yeah, well, what about race? That's dismissing a legitimate critique of your position with a what about statement. It would be better to engage that critique and to wrestle down. And I would encourage you to engage it, because going back to what Paul taught us, we all need to make up our own mind, and we're going to give an account to God for how we steward the agency he's given us. And we need to not violate our conscience. So the critiques, the legitimate, thoughtful critiques of your brothers and sisters can actually help you develop your conscience and to listen to your conscience on matters. So this is really important. So I want to encourage us not to engage, recognize legitimate critiques and weaknesses, and not just dismiss them with what about statements. Now, let's talk briefly about voting your conscience. Now, I'm going to put voting, the decision of how to vote, I'm going to put it in the realm of conscience. And I'm going to put it in the realm of conscience because I recognize that there are different Christian convictions on how to vote. And I don't think, as your pastor, that I need to bind your conscience on places to vote. As a pastor, I have to, when you're talking to me, you're talking to two people at once. And you're talking to an individual who has to weigh all these things out for myself. And then you're also talking to a pastor. And tonight you're talking to a pastor. And I have my pastor sweater on. And anytime I put cashmere on, I'm in pastor mode. So when I've got my pastor sweater on, my job is to be clear around the boundaries of the Christian faith. It is to bind your conscience on matters of orthodoxy and of Christian integrity. And it is to actually to leave room for your conscience on matters of conscience. To bind your conscience on matters of liberty is actually to overstep my bounds as a pastor. I shared some of this last week. I'm going to put voting, especially in the current cultural and political climate we live in, that has very complex matters to weigh out, knowing that people weigh it out differently. My choice would either be bind people's conscience in one direction and divide the church, or not bind your conscience. And so I'm not doing it just out of political expediency. I'm doing it out of a conviction that I want to create space for people of different cultures to be together in the same church. And I want to be very careful not to harm your faith. And so I'm not going to bind your conscience. I'm going to ask you to vote your conscience. Now, I think one of Jesus's famous teachings is actually very, very helpful in weighing out these matters of conscience and voting. This is his famous "Render to Caesar" passage. Now, the background of this is there was a tax that they had to pay to Caesar, and the tax was also considered a tribute to Caesar. So it was considered a way of not just like giving Caesar some money to run the government, although it did do that, but it was also considered a tribute to Caesar, and Caesar thought of himself as God. And so there was a lot of debate within the Jewish community about, is it right or is it not right? And those were really the two choices they had. Is it right, or they thought they had? Is it right or is it not right to pay this tax to Caesar? There was a group called the Herodians also represented by the biblical party, the Sadducees. And the Sadducees had basically made peace with Rome, and so they said, yeah, you should pay the tax, and they were considered by the Pharisees to be compromisers because they gave allegiance to Caesar that was properly due to God. So both parties actually didn't like Jesus, and so they're going to come together here and try to trap him. So here's how it goes in Matthew chapter 22. Then the Pharisees went and plotted how to entangle him in his words. And they sent their disciples to him along with the Herodians. This is the other party. So it's like the Democrats plotted how to entangle Jesus in his words, and they sent their disciples with him along with the Trump supporters and MAGA hats, saying, "Teacher, we know that you are true and teach the way of God truthfully, and you do not care about anyone's opinion, for you're not swayed by appearances." They're buttering him up. "Tell us then what you think. Is it lawful to pay taxes to Caesar or not?" Notice that it's framed as a binary choice. It's either right or it's wrong. Is it lawful to pay taxes to Caesar or not? But Jesus, aware of their malice, said, "Why do you put me to the test, you hypocrites? Show me the coin for the tax." And they brought him a denarius. A denarius was 1 day's wage for a laborer. So the tax was about a day's income, which I would take right now as an income tax. I would just take a day's wage. I'd pay a day's wage and file my 1040 right now. I might file a couple in advance if they'll let me make some payments for next year. So the point is, it's not an onerous tax. It's not an onerous tax. It's a pretty reasonable tax. And Jesus said to them, "Whose likeness and inscription is this on the coin?" And they said, "Caesar's." And then he said to them, "Therefore, render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God's." When they heard it, they marveled, and they left him, and they went away. Now, what Jesus does is he actually says, this is not a binary choice. This is not it's right to do it or it's wrong to do it. This is actually, there's a way to render to Caesar what is due to him and to still render to God what is due to him. And the phrase, "therefore, render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's," literally means give back to Caesar what Caesar has given you. Caesar has given you the coin. His inscription is on it, belongs to him. Give it back to him. And God has given you something, so give it back to him. What God has given you is your life, so give your life back to God. So this is Jesus saying, pay your tax to Caesar. And then if the pushback from the Pharisees would have been, but by paying that tax to Caesar, we're inflating his ego. Or by paying that tax to Caesar, we are supporting policies that are unjust. Jesus says, well, Caesar gave you the coin, so it wouldn't be wrong to give it back to him. I think there's a parallel there. The United States Constitution gave you your vote. It would not be wrong to give your vote back to the United States. And you can do that while still giving God what is due to God, which is your worship. So here's some principles I'm going to draw out of it. It's right and it's reasonable to vote. That in our society, that is what you would call giving to Caesar, giving back to Caesar what Caesar gave to you. So it's right and it's reasonable to vote. Now, your vote is not bound to two options. There are only one of two people who are going to win, but your vote is not bound to two options. So in saying it's right and reasonable to vote, you actually have many options within who to vote for. So it's right and reasonable to vote, and you could hash that out in many different ways. You are voting in a fallen system. You are paying taxes to Caesar in a fallen system. You are voting in a fallen system. I don't think there's any way to vote in the American system and vote consistently across the board all of my Christian convictions. The Christianity tells me I should love the poor. I should care about the plight of the poor. I should especially care about the plight of immigrants and refugees. I should care about the unborn, and I should protect the life of the unborn. And it tells me I should care about racial justice. I don't find those all in one place. So you're voting in a fallen system. Your vote should represent your best judgment. It should be a reflection of your conscience. and it shouldn't violate your conscience, and you shouldn't let anyone talk you into violating your conscience. But your vote should not represent your total allegiance. Now, this is why I encourage you to be able to critique your own party, or be able to critique the way you're inclined to vote, or be able to entertain and to listen to the critiques of your own position. If you can't primarily critique your own party or your own inclination without making what about statements and pointing to the other side's faults, then your political position probably represents an allegiance that really only belongs to God. So your vote should not represent your total allegiance. And then the last thing I would remind you is politics is more than voting. So politics is also advocating. Politics is also discussing politics. Politics is also being involved in public life in ways that bring good. One of the things that I've been really fascinated to I was talking with someone about this recently. We were talking about how the pro-life movement is more than a just vote pro-life movement, and it's more than just an overturn Roe v. Wade at the Supreme Court movement. There's been a whole emphasis on adoption as a result of the pro-life movement. There's also been an emphasis on reaching out to young mothers, especially who are in crisis pregnancies. There's crisis pregnancy centers in our city. That's political activity. So recognize that voting is part of a bigger framework of political activity. You should have all of your political activity in mind. So those are some principles I'm going to give you to vote your conscience. Well, that's the end of my presentation. I'm going to remind you to send questions to podcast@fellowshipdenver.org. You can email them there, or you can text one word podcast, PODCAST, all one word, to 94000, and you'll get the form by which to submit questions. This Wednesday on the Vision for Life podcast, we're taking up some of your questions from last week, which are really good. Dave Moreland and Autumn Gardner and myself are there talking through some of your questions. So can't wait to share that with you. You guys are sending good questions. I'm going to also remind you of some resources that I'm recommending to help us think and weigh these matters. Here's a book called How the Nations Rage by Jonathan Leeman. I drew from that extensively in prior weeks. Last week, I shared this article, Justice in the Bible, by Timothy Keller. He gives some principles for weighing out matters of public justice. This is a couple of smart people books I encourage you to read last week, and I hope you'll continue to. I hope 2 or 3 of you will take me up on this, and you'll help all of us. Political Visions and Illusions: A Survey and Christian Critique of Contemporary Ideologies by David Koizis. This is the little book, Uneasy Conscience of Modern Fundamentalism by Carl Henry. And then if you want to think about what it's like to live in a time when the world is becoming more urban and how that affects all the cultures coming together, this is the book that I quoted earlier, The Homeless Mind, subtitle Modernization and Consciousness by Peter Berker. Well, at this point, I'm going to stop sharing my screen here, and Angie has been queuing up questions. So, Angie, if you have something queued up there, I'd love to spend a few minutes with questions.
I do. I want to give a tiny direction for tonight's questions. Hopefully you haven't already emailed them in, because I don't have access to that email. So send them here to the Q&A box, which is just on the bottom of the screen. So that would be helpful.
Taking up some of them in the podcast as well. So, and I know the presentation was a little long-winded tonight. So if we don't get to answer them all, we'll take some up on the podcast.
Yeah, I think we've got a few. We can maybe go till 9:30, but okay. Feel free if you guys have to jump off. You do. So let me pull this first one up. So the first one I've got is just on the actual issue of voting. What sorts of things should factor into voting? Should we vote based on a platform or a single issue, or should we factor in candidates' characters, personality, which of those is more important, things like that.
Yeah. So to kind of frame this up, I've heard different versions of this conversation quite a bit. One says, hey, we really have to factor in platforms, and the two parties, right, the two major political parties in America have pretty different platforms on a lot of different issues, and they really represent some pretty divergent worldview on different issues. So one perspective says we should primarily vote on issues and platform and worldview. Another perspective says, well, we're also voting, for a person. And, in the case of a presidential election, we're voting. I care about not just what that person says they want to do in their platform and their policies. I also care about the kind of person they are. I've particularly heard that with people wrestling about President Trump. I've heard some say, I'm going to vote for him because I support him on the issues, or I support him on a couple of major issues that I weight most heavily. And I know he's not the best guy, but I think that's just the nature of politics. And then I've heard other people say, I can't vote for him, based on character. So I've heard that come up. I heard that a lot in the other direction with Hillary Clinton in 2016. So how do you weight these things? I'll give you my opinion. This is my opinion that you don't have to follow. I think at some level, both issues, worldview, platform on the one hand, character on the other hand, I think they both matter at some level. Now, they might matter in some instances more than others. They might matter in some years or some elections more than others. But I think ultimately they both matter. And if I just speak about the office of president, for example, I think the political culture of America is influenced by who the president is, what his temperament is, what his character is. I think it's influenced by that, and also know that his policy commitments really matter, and what he says he's going to do really matter. I recently read and audiobooked a fascinating book on the American presidency. It was called The Hardest Job in the World. I think it came out this year, The Hardest Job in the World, the American presidency. And it was an analysis of how the presidency has evolved over the years from George Washington till today. And what I found really interesting was, according to, I believe John Dickerson's the author, according to his research, on policy, the president has the most influence on matters of what we would call foreign policy or international policy. And he even interviewed all the presidents, and they all remarked how surprised they were how much time they spent on foreign policy, international policy. So he's making the case they have the most agency. They're given the most authority to act unilaterally in those matters. So they actually have that ends up shaping their administrations more than they usually realize. And then he did quite a bit of study on how presidents can use their what we call their informal authority, their pulpit, their platform. And so I think for that reason that both policy and who they are matters. There was an excellent article by Jonathan Leeman, who I've been citing his book. He published an article at 9marks. It's .com or .org. It's the number 9. marks.org.com. He published an article on kind of a Christian perspective on voting. How do you weight different things? Really thoughtful. He did not tell you how to vote. It did seem from reading the article, just as a disclaimer, it seemed from reading the article that he's inclined to vote third party or for neither of the two major candidates. That seemed to be the decision he was leading you to. But he made an excellent point in there about character. He said, policy your vote matters because you are giving authorization to the candidate who represents you to implement what he says he's going to implement. So platform and positions and issues matter. And then he said, you're also giving them authorization to lead within a certain sphere of power and who they are matters. And he used a great example in there. He said, if you are electing a coach for your Little League baseball team and you elect a coach who has a tendency to tell racist jokes, then you should not be surprised if telling racist jokes becomes kind of normalized on your Little League baseball team and in the dugout there. He's, by his influence, he's saying to the kids, that's acceptable. That's okay. He's giving permission to that. So it was a little analogy he used to say, who a president is, his character also matters as much as positions. So I think that was a pretty intelligent argument to me.
That's really helpful.
I know people will weight those differently, and I think you're free to. And I would say too, over the years, the parties have become more divergent. So the positions are more, the differences on positions and policy are probably more defined than they've ever been in our history. And so for that reason, I vote mainly on position. I mean, that makes sense to me too, even if it's not the direction that I lean.
Yeah, well, I think it makes sense, even just what you said, that we're voting in a fallen system. So all votes are sort of affected by that. Something you said though, Lean, ties in really well to this next question. How do you suggest a Christian respond to the statement, if you aren't voting Democrat or you're not voting Republican, you're wasting your vote or you're voting for the other party, which I feel like is a rhetoric that we're hearing a lot these days.
Well, there's some truth in that your candidate is probably not going to win. So you know that. But I think this is why we spent time in Romans 14. I think listening to your conscience, not doing anything that would be a violation of your conscience, is really important. And so if really you can't vote for either one without violating your conscience, then you're not throwing away your vote. You're discharging your obligation as a citizen, and you're doing it in a way that maintains your conscience before the Lord. So I would say follow your conscience and give you freedom to do that.
That's really great. I think we've got time for just one more question, and the rest we'll just pass on to the podcast. Double it up for this week. Something you said was that we're sort of underdeveloped in loving each other. So this is really a practical question. What do we do in that when we are having a conversation, or I'm adding this, more likely when we're seeing something on social media that just enrages us? What do we do to become people that are more loving?
Yeah. I would say listen to Sunday's sermon. But we talked about love bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, endures all things. And we talked about the value of bearing with each other and enduring each other when we are really annoying or enraging. The value of that is it creates a context in which we can all grow into our future self. So I get being annoyed by people. I'm easily annoyed by people. I'm just like one of those people that can be like, I'm so good at despising. It comes so naturally and easily to me. But when I say, man, here's my brother in Christ, here's my sister in Christ, and they are on a journey and they are growing, and God has put his spirit within them, and he is working out his salvation in them. And when I can see them in that light, it just takes a lot of my angst away. It may not take my disagreement away, but it takes a lot of my scorn away. So I would say, when you see it on social media and you're outraged, turn it off, and you can mute people, you can unfollow people, you can, but remember who they are. Then I think the second thing I would do, and this is, we didn't get to develop this very much because we had a lot of content tonight, but where Tim Keller was saying, watch your motives, I think that's really important. And one of the things that happens with matters of culture, which then inform our convictions, one of the things that happens, just the human heart is great at doing, is we justify ourselves based on being right about things and cultural preferences. We take pride in our cultures, right? Um, and we draw self-esteem by who we're connected to and what we're connected to. So the human heart is just bound up that way, right? So sometimes when we're upset at someone and we maybe we don't want to listen to their argument, it's because we feel like something that's really, really important to us has been threatened. And so I would just ask us to look at what we think is important to us and ask, hey, have I put more weight on that than I need to put on that?
That's great. Well, I think that is about all the time we have. We've definitely come closest to 9:30 this night as any of the nights.
All right, guys. Well, next week, let me give this little preview. Next week, we're going to talk about some broad trends in American history and in American culture that are really informing our current political climate. So we're going to talk about things like what has happened on the right spectrum of American culture, particularly as it pertains to matters of white supremacy and nationalism that we've seen rising up. We're going to talk about what's happened on the left of the American political spectrum, particularly as it pertains to different theories of social justice and how that's informed our current political debate. And so we're going to talk about some of that stuff to understand the climate that we're living in.
Man, can't wait.
All right, guys. We'll see you next week.
If you guys have, if you missed any of the previous ones or want to share this one, it'll be up in our podcast feed, usually by Wednesday. And the notes, Hunter's slideshow are always in the notes from that. So that's the best place to find this and to share it with people.
Awesome. Vision for Life podcast. Thanks, Angie. Thank
See
you,
y'all.
guys. Love you guys. Good night.